What happens when a Christian challenges modern academic skepticism, using AI of all things? Spoiler, the tool built on Enlightenment logic just proves Scripture true. I get why I do what I do. I believe in God, so I make videos to spread His word. It's my mission. That's the whole point of my channel. I want to spread the word of God. What I don't understand is these people that make videos, they spend their time trying to diminish God.
Christianity wasn't created by Jesus, but by a Jewish tent maker from Turkey.
Okay, what's the point of that? I'm about to show you an example of how most modern academics talk about the Bible. They hide behind their literary analysis in order to come across as objective, when their objective is clear as day, and their bias comes shining through every time without fail. That is, if you know what to look for. The objective of the modern Bible scholar is simply to subvert the Word of God at every turn. Modern scholarship is built upon rationalism and Enlightenment principles, and these evolved not from a sophistication in how we approach scholarship, as they want you to believe, but from a point of view of revolution against the church. Before we look at the clip that will be central to this video, I want you to be aware of the one question that underpins every single point this so-called academic attempts to make. And that one question is known in scholarly circles as the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem. The synoptic problem is an acknowledgement and attempt to answer the question of which synoptic gospel was written first. You see, Matthew, Mark, and Luke share so much in common that they are seen together, which is what the word synoptic means. The prefix syn means together, like in synthesis, and optic refers to the eye, like in optical illusion. And by seen together, what we mean is that the synoptic gospels share so much in common, it is undeniable that someone is copying someone else. But who and why? The traditional view was that Matthew wrote first, and that was the view for over 1700 years. The majority view today, however, is that Mark wrote first. This debate is incredibly important because if Matthew wrote first, then that means what Christians believe about the Bible is true. Whereas if Mark wrote first, it means that what these modern academics believe about Christians is true, which is to say, they know we're wrong, and our holy book is a lot less holy than we think. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. For now, I want us to watch this clip and see how the modern, non-believing Bible scholar thinks. I will then use AI to prove how almost every single point made in this clip can at the very least be legitimately challenged, if not proven wrong altogether. And I mean every single point. Nearly every syllable Bible scholar Ilan Gilad says is completely wrong, which begs the question, why even say it? What's the point?
Every Christian knows the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's completely wrong. The four Gospels were written between 70 and 100 CE by anonymous authors. We know this because the earliest manuscripts don't include any names, no titles, no Gospel according to, just a story starting mid-scene with no author attached.
The first point he makes is that the Gospels were not written by who Christians believe they were, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he says he knows this because the earliest manuscripts had no names attached. That's the whole point he's making. Let's see if it's true. I asked AI, is it true that the original manuscripts of the Gospels don't have authors attributed to them? And here's what AI said. That's a common claim, but the evidence tells a more nuanced story. We don't have the original manuscripts of the Gospels, only copies made decades or centuries later. But here's what's striking. All the earliest surviving copies that include the beginning or end of a gospel contain author attributions, like according to Matthew, kata Matthean, or according to Mark, Kata Markan. There are no known manuscript copies of the four canonical Gospels that are truly anonymous, in the sense of lacking any author's name where we'd expect it. What is more, the AI adds, critics sometimes argue that the names were added later, but there is no manuscript evidence of a time when the Gospels circulated without attribution, and the earliest church fathers like Irenaeus, Papias, and Origen consistently affirmed the traditional authorship in the 2nd century and beyond. Okay, so according to AI, which seems to always lean toward the academic consensus, as I will show you momentarily, yet despite that tendency, it makes itself quite clear that what this Bible scholar just claimed is completely false. Again, despite AI's tendency to lean toward such an opinion, evidenced by its initial claim that the answer to this question is nuanced, when in fact it's incredibly straightforward and not nuanced at all. Read it back and you will see what I mean. No nuance. But the AI always seems to need to soften the blow whenever the truth of the Bible is proclaimed, which is often and always. The other thing he said was that the Gospels were written between 70 and 100 AD. If Mark wrote first, then that statement would be true. But since it's my contention, which aligns with church tradition, that Matthew wrote first, it is also my contention that Matthew's Gospel was written in the late 50s AD, and Luke's Gospel, which I believe to have been written second, like St. Augustine came to believe, was written in the early 60s. And what's striking is that AI completely backs up both of my claims. Mark's Gospel, we agree, was written around 70 AD, and John's Gospel, we also agree, was written sometime between 85 and 95 AD, when John was in exile on the island of Patmos. So let's continue.
So where did the names come from? In the 2nd century, as different Christian groups were battling over which stories about Jesus were legit, church leaders needed to draw lines, which Gospels had authority and which did not. Their solution? Attach big names to the anonymous text they wanted to promote. Matthew and John, two of Jesus' apostles. Mark, supposedly Peter's interpreter. Luke, Paul's travel companion. It was genius-level religious branding, but the evidence doesn't back it up.
So now the point he's making is that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were randomly attached to the Gospels because they are the books that the church leaders at that time were trying to promote. This is wrong on so many levels. Like there's not even a hint of truth in any part of what he's saying. Again, let's just ask AI. Did the church fathers create the Bible, or did it develop more organically? Because those were the books being read by everyone already. And once again, the AI attempts to soften the blow for the academics, as the Bible is proven true for Christians once more. AI says, that's a rich and important question, and the answer is a bit of both. Although it's not really both, the AI is just once again leaning toward the academics, even though what it's about to say contradicts them completely. It's a bit of both. The Bible developed organically over time, but the church fathers played a crucial role in recognizing, preserving, and eventually formalizing what had already become authoritative in Christian communities. So this is not promoting these books, but rather putting them all together, like gathering papers into a folder to keep things organized. The AI, despite its posturing, tells us the truth. The Gospels became authoritative in Christian communities long before the Church Fathers ever got involved. Let's read more of what AI said on this so there will be no confusion. Early Christian communities were already reading and circulating many of the texts we now call the New Testament, especially the Gospels and Paul's letters, by the mid-2nd century. These teachings were used in worship, teaching, and defense of the faith, and were often quoted by early theologians like Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and Clement of Alexandria. So the church fathers didn't create the Bible from scratch. They recognized and affirmed the text that had already gained widespread use and theological weight. Figures like Origen, Athanasius, and Augustine compile lists of books they considered authoritative. These lists varied slightly, but by the 4th century there was growing consensus. Okay, so the point is, once again, the Bible scholar is wrong, and the traditional Christian believer is right. Let's continue with the clip.
Take Matthew. The author writes in polished Greek, copies most of Mark, and clearly doesn't know Judean geography. Would the actual disciple need to plagiarize someone else's account?
And there it is. Would an actual apostle have to plagiarize someone else's account? This is what I meant when I said their entire argument hinges upon the Gospel of Mark being written first. As I've already shown, AI corroborates my earlier dating of Matthew's Gospel. But let's dive into this fully to clear up this nonsense once and for all. Let us ask AI, what evidence do Bible scholars use to prove that Mark's Gospel was written first? Fair question, right? Most Bible scholars who support Markan priority, the idea the Gospel of Mark was written before Matthew and Luke, point to several key lines of evidence. Literary dependence. Over 90% of Mark's content appears in Matthew, and about 50% in Luke. This overlap suggests that Matthew and Luke likely used Mark as a source rather than the other way around. Hold on right there. Hold on right there. I know all about who used how much of who. I've covered this all in great detail. After you're done with this, I'd suggest you check out my video here if you want to explore this subject further. But for now, let's break down the numbers and what the AI is really saying here. Another way to put this is that 97% of Mark is found in Matthew and Luke combined, which means almost every last bit of Mark is accounted for by the other two synoptic gospels. Wouldn't it then make more logical sense that Mark is copying Matthew and Luke and adding nothing new, rather than Matthew and Luke each copying Mark independently of each other, accounting for nearly every last piece of Mark? We'll come back to this in a second. First, let us continue to look at the rest of the evidence that scholars use to argue that Mark wrote first. The order of events. When Matthew and Luke differ in order of events, they usually agree with Mark's sequence. But when Matthew and Luke agree against Mark, it's often in content, not order. This implies Mark's structure was the base both drew from. It's almost as if the AI is trying to sound overly complicated here. So I ask it, you say when Matthew and Luke differ, they usually agree with Mark. What exactly does that mean? Great question. That phrase refers to a pattern scholars have noticed when comparing the order and wording of stories across the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Here's the idea. When Matthew and Luke include the same story but place it differently, they tend to follow Mark's sequence rather than each other's. This suggests that Mark's order was the common reference point for both. For example, the healing of the paralytic, Mark 2, 1-12, comes early in Mark. Matthew 9, 1-8, and Luke 5, 17-26 both include it, and they place it in roughly the same spot as Mark. But when Matthew and Luke disagree on order, and Mark has a version too, they usually both match Mark, not each other. This pattern is one of the strongest clues that Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source, adapting and expanding on it independently. Want to see a side-by-side example in action? AI asks. To which I reply, yes. Awesome, let's take a look at a concrete example. As I start to go through the side-by-side, I draw the opposite conclusion. To me, this seems like evidence that Mark wrote third. And the reason that Matthew and Luke both match Mark is because Mark is merging the two Gospels that came before him. So I then ask AI, based on your examples, doesn't it make more sense that Mark wrote third with the goal of harmonizing the divergent points between Matthew and Luke, especially since whenever all three present the same story, Mark's passage is usually the longest and combines half of Matthew's verses and half of Luke's? AI replies, that's a sharp observation, and one that's actually been taken seriously in scholarly circles. What you're describing is the Griesbach hypothesis, also known as the two gospel hypothesis, which argues that Matthew was written first. Luke used Matthew, and then Mark wrote third, drawing from both to create a kind of streamlined, synthesized version. And then the AI gives me three great pieces of evidence to prove that Mark wrote third. The first is Mark's middle position. In triple tradition passages, stories found in all three synoptics, Mark often seems to blend Matthew and Luke's wording. This could suggest he had both in front of him and was harmonizing. The second piece of evidence that Mark wrote third is Mark's length and detail, not content. While Mark's versions are often longer in terms of vivid detail, e.g., more action verbs, emotional reactions, they don't necessarily contain more material. Instead, they may elaborate on what's already in Matthew or Luke. And the third piece of evidence that Mark wrote third is editorial fatigue. Some scholars argue that if Mark were first, it's odd that Matthew and Luke would independently omit or alter some of Mark's most dramatic moments, like the young man fleeing naked in Gethsemane. But if Mark came last, he may have added these flourishes. And to me, the most convincing piece of evidence that Mark wrote third and not first is not mentioned here by AI, but will be confirmed if you were to ask it. And that has to do with Mark's use of the word palin, which means again. This word appears in Mark's Gospel 15 times, and not once does it appear in Matthew or Luke. It seems incredibly strange that if Matthew or Luke were copying Mark, again, 97% of Mark is accounted for in Matthew and Luke combined, that neither one of them would use the word palin, which means again, even one time. It makes a lot more sense that Mark wrote third, copying Matthew and Luke, and added it as part of his own personal style. This is referred to as Markan overlay. So after going through many side-by-side examples with AI, which seem to prove that Mark did in fact write third, I said to AI, it seems as though this is all pretty convincing that Mark wrote third. Is it possible that Markan priority holds the majority opinion among Bible scholars today because they do not believe in the truth of the gospel and their real intended goal is to subvert the truth? Because if they can prove that Mark wrote first, then the author of Matthew's gospel can't be Matthew the apostle? Because why would an apostle have to copy the words of someone who wasn't? AI replies, that's a deeply thoughtful and important question, and it touches not just on textual criticism, but on the motivations and worldviews that shape scholarship itself. First, you're absolutely right that Markan priority challenges traditional authorship claims, especially the idea that Matthew the Apostle wrote the Gospel of Matthew. If Mark wrote first and Matthew used Mark as a source, it raises the question, why would an eyewitness rely on a non-eyewitness? But of course, AI has to defend the modern scholar, as it always does. But here's the nuance, AI continues. Most scholars who support Markan priority don't necessarily do so to undermine the faith. Rather, they're applying historical critical methods, tools developed to analyze ancient texts the way one might study Homer or Herodotus. These methods prioritize internal evidence, like literary patterns, vocabulary, and structure, over traditional attributions unless those attributions are strongly corroborated. So the AI is saying that scholars use certain literary analysis methods to remain objective while they tear down the Christian faith. The AI says that the scholar prioritizes internal evidence. We just went over the internal evidence, and it's clear as day that Mark wrote third. Nonetheless, they still hold on to their BS Markan priority opinion. And the AI also says the scholars only rely on traditional attributions if they are strongly corroborated. How about the fact that all early church fathers agreed on who wrote the Gospels? All. Does that not matter in this case? All of them agree. Look, all of them, every single one. Like I said, all the early church fathers agreed. All. Not some, all. What a joke. I go on to ask AI about the scholars' supposedly objective methods of textual analysis, saying, yeah, but scholars can make literary analysis fit into whatever critical literary method they want to. Literary analysis is a fluid process. You're absolutely right, the AI responds, that literary analysis, especially in biblical studies, can be shaped by the assumptions and frameworks scholars bring to the table. It's not just about the data, it's the lens. Exactly. I couldn't have said it any better myself. And in this case, the lens is a bit cloudy. He says that Matthew's gospel was written in polished Greek.
Take Matthew. The author writes in polished Greek.
It would be if the author was copying Mark, but since he wasn't, it wasn't. It was actually written in Hebrew. You see, the first Christians were originally Jews, many of whom aligned themselves with the theology of James, the Lord's brother. He was their de facto leader. But before we get into that, let's take a step back for a second and look at Paul's letter to the Galatians. In this letter, all is made clear. Paul speaks of going to visit Peter and James, the Lord's brother, in Jerusalem. And Paul speaks of two different gospels, one for the Jews and one for the Gentiles. This is not a metaphor or some other kind of rhetorical flourish, but rather a fact of history. You see, Matthew's gospel was the gospel for the Jews that James represented, and Luke's gospel was the gospel for the Gentiles, which Paul represented. As Eusebius writes, Paul was in the habit of referring to Luke's gospel as my gospel. These were the two main factions in the early church. On the one hand, you have the Jewish Christians, who aligned themselves with James, the Lord's brother, and the Gospel of Matthew, which establishes Jesus as the new Moses, the new lawgiver, who says he didn't come to change even a dot of the law. And on the other hand, you have the Gentile Christians, who are aligned with Paul and the Gospel of Luke, which establishes Jesus as the Savior of the world, not just a particular race of people, who speaks of a good Samaritan, a good Gentile. So yes, as the first gospel, written in the late 50s AD, Matthew wrote in Hebrew for a mostly Jewish audience who followed James, and not in Greek like Luke's gospel, who was written for the Gentiles. The thing is, Elon Gilad knows all this, or at least he should, because in an earlier video he speaks of this exact divide in the early church, in a different attempt to subvert Christianity.
The Jerusalem church, led by Jesus' brother James and including Jesus' original disciples, strongly opposed Paul's interpretation, but history sided with Paul. When Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, the Jewish Christian movement was decimated, while Paul's Gentile churches flourished across the Roman Empire.
What else is particularly interesting is that Peter found himself quite literally in the middle of this feud between James and Paul. In Galatians, Paul says, "But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision." Galatians 2:11-12. Clearly, Peter spent his time divided between the Gentiles and Jews, between Paul and James. This is where this gets really interesting because of how Mark fits into this. Much the same way Peter finds himself in the middle between James and Paul, so too is Mark the middling force, so to speak, between Matthew and Luke. And what's more, Mark's connection to Peter enhances this understanding exponentially. You see, even these non-believing scholars will begrudgingly accept this connection, saying things like,
Mark, supposedly Peter's interpreter.
the first letter of Peter makes this connection clear when he refers to Mark as his son. 1 Peter 5:13. Elon Gilad says that Mark's gospel reads like oral traditions.
Mark reads like collected oral traditions.
And I agree. It reads that way because it is that way. Papias tells us that Mark recorded Peter's oral teachings. You see, the Gospel of Mark fulfills two roles. It is first for all intents and purposes, Peter's gospel. He is the first apostle mentioned and the last apostle mentioned. And it is also the gospel that harmonizes the previous two, the gospel for the Jews, Matthew, and the gospel for the Gentiles, Luke, which Paul describes in his letter to the Galatians. So now you're starting to see how it all came together. All the pieces fit perfectly. Let's keep going with the clip.
Then there's John, written 60, 70 years after Jesus' death, in abstract Greek prose. The author refers to the disciple whom Jesus loved in third person. If John wrote it, why wouldn't he just say me? Mark and Luke don't even pretend to be eyewitnesses. Mark reads like collected oral traditions, and Luke literally opens by saying, I myself have investigated everything from the beginning and decided to write an orderly account. That's not a witness, that's a researcher.
He says that John wrote his gospel 60 to 70 years after Jesus' death. This is one of the few accurate statements that Mr. Gallad has made. He actually says the truth here, because the truth sounds like a bad thing. But it's actually pretty cool why and how this is. You see, every other apostle was brutally murdered for their beliefs. Peter was crucified upside down. Paul was beheaded. Matthew was skinned alive. And James was thrown from the temple. But John, on the other hand, couldn't be killed. As a matter of fact, he was boiled in oil and walked away as if nothing ever happened. As a result, John was sent into exile on the island of Patmos in Greece. He is the only apostle for which we don't have the bones. As far as we know, he never died. Many Christians believe he was assumed up to heaven just like Mary was. Nonetheless, John did in fact write his gospel about 50 to 60 years after Jesus' death. But to say that John didn't write it because he used the third person and referred to himself as the apostle whom Jesus loved instead of using I, that is the poorest of all possible arguments that could be made. Surely an academic such as Mr. Gallad would understand basic writing skills. The best nonfiction writers avoid the first person whenever possible in favor of the third person, which sounds not only more neutral and objective, but it reads better. So yeah, it would have sounded tackier if he used I. Even Luke, who does use the first person, only does so at the very beginning as an address, and then never refers to himself again. This man's logic doesn't even follow. One minute he says that the church fathers attach big names to the Gospels to add authority,
Their solution? Attach big names to the anonymous text they wanted to promote.
and the next minute he's saying Mark and Luke don't even pretend to be eyewitnesses.
Mark and Luke don't even pretend to be eyewitnesses.
A simple guess as to why. Because no one is pretending about anything. If Mark is just collecting oral traditions and Luke is just a researcher, why attach their names to the Gospels unless they are the ones who actually wrote them? There's no authoritative benefit. I think we just answered our own question. If the church fathers were just going to attach names to the Gospels willy-nilly, then why not make them all written by apostles and not just two? And why add one of those two 6 decades after Jesus' death, unless John, who we know was still alive at that time, wrote it? So you see how easy it is for someone to subvert Christianity coming from a seemingly neutral and academic point of view, when in fact, every single point he tried to make can be debunked by AI, which is created from the same rationalistic thought process he uses at every turn, which is to say, a process that tends to reject all spiritual truth. Nonetheless, the truth is the truth, and it can't be denied by anyone or anything.